Hi there, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of the Neurodivergent Nook podcast. And I'm Helen Neale. I'm a therapist and also an autistic ADHD person. So I'll be coming from both a professional and a lived experience perspective. And I'll just pass over to Diane, and she's going to introduce herself too.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Diane. I've also have ADHD and autism. I am a previous retired head teacher and Senko and taught for 25 years. I'm now an education consultant supporting SEND provision in schools. And I also coach and mentor neurodivergent children and teenagers, and also a foster carer and a parent of neurodivergent children.
Which we both are, actually, which I forgot to say. Of course, I forgot something. So today we're actually going to be touching on something that isn't just relevant to autistic ADHDers. It's a broad brush area around sensory processing, sensory needs and sensory differences. I guess that what would be really helpful actually is to maybe start with a little bit of lived experience.
Yes, yeah.
And if you don't mind, Diane, maybe having a chat about how you have experienced your sensory needs and maybe how that sort of feeds into your lived experience.
Okay. So I can think back, and this is one of my strongest childhood memories. When I was in primary school, my dad used to pick me up from the bus stop at the end of our road, and it's about less than a 10-minute walk down to our home. And it feels like in my memory that every day I would cry as when we walked down the road to get home, my kind of knee-high primary school socks would fall down. And my dad didn't understand that I needed them pulled up to be tight. So the memory is of my dad just saying, hurry up, come on, get a move on, and me needing the socks properly before I could walk again. Fast track another 40 years later, and you realise, that was all part of my sensory needs and needing to, the socks to be feeling a certain way around my legs and everything. And yeah, just, years of, having been a late diagnosed for autism and ADHD, years of that uncomfortableness around things, whether it's, cold water in a swimming pool, or whether it's, feeling that clothes are too tight and loose, kind of those kind of sort of classic feelings as well. Noise, like I can't stand loud music, if I'm feeling stressed or tired, but, put me in years and years of going to clubs and raves and festivals and, and I want the loudest music ever. So yeah, I think just that massive overwhelm that comes with sensory processing difficulties. And if you don't know you're neurodivergent and that you've got it, or if you're neurotypical and you have it, why you might be feeling that way. And certainly from now being a woman who's 53 this year and perimenopausal, my sensory processing difficulties have gone completely haywire. I cannot have dinner at the dinner table with the family unless the low lights are on. I cannot eat with the bright lights on. If Paul, my husband goes to talk to me in the car, he has to turn the radio down before I can listen to him. So, all of my sensories will need to just be really, really basic before I can engage in the world a little bit, really. Yeah.
And from what you're saying there, it's that that overwhelm. And when we talk about the bottom-up processing within the neurodivergent space, rather than being able to pick what we need to pay attention to, we pay attention to everything, and it all comes in at once. And it becomes really, really difficult because of that bottom-up processing to pick out what particular sensory input we need to be paying attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know what's we're needing or what we're needing less of, isn't it?
Yeah.
We sometimes cannot find that without help or with somebody, guiding us
and understanding that difference as well.
Yeah. And I think, having worked in schools most of my life, you see children dysregulated because of their sensory needs all of the time. And, I remember as a head, I used to, do an audit with my schools and my teachers quite often, is your classroom kind of sensory aware? For teachers, teaching assistants to be, kind of ticking off and checking, you know, if the children are sitting on the floor at the front of the class, is that sunlight, you know, too bright? You know, can some children hear the noise of the electricity of the, you know, the fluorescent tubing lighting and all the rest of it? Are they going to be distracted by, you know, children, you know, singing down the hall? And that really, really helped, you know, one particular school that I was working with, and we changed lots of things in terms of less clutter on the walls, you know, so there wasn't so much visual stimuli, you know, etc. And I think, having worked in early years a lot, you know, many years as well, that's the stuff that you see when children come in and start school. You don't suddenly say, oh, that child's got autism or that child's got ADHD or whatever it might be. You know, you say that child's overwhelmed. And, you know, regardless of what diagnosis they may or may not have, or even if, as we said, neurotypical with sensory needs, if you can help them feel regulated and do less or more of what they need, then, you know, life works so much more smoothly for that child. But, you know, you also have to have the support of the parents and carers at home, because, you know, child's only at school for 6 odd hours, and that sensory diet needs to be there all of the time.
Yeah. And it sounds like it's very much about understanding that difference between, you know, an individual that is sensory seeking for particular senses, and we'll talk about this a bit later about, you know, the number of senses and what we might be talking about there, and also the areas that are sensory triggering. And I noticed you were talking about loud music, but you also love concerts, and I think sometimes that can be a little bit confusing, because it can also be a regulating activity if we have autonomy over it, and if we're in charge, and it's not something that suddenly happened like that, you know, that loud sound that is startling, rather than that loud concert that we chose to go to.
That you chose to. And I totally agree about the autonomy. The last few months I've been doing some workshops with neurodivergent teenagers, and that was something that they all said, that, you know, they love listening to, you know, music really loud in their, you know, in their headphones. But yeah, totally that, you know, put them into an environment where they haven't chosen that music, and complete kind of sensory meltdown or overload, you know, it hits them. So yeah, I definitely think it's about having that autonomy, isn't it, as well?
And also the safety as well, I guess. You know, what environment do they feel safe in? And if they're at home listening to loud music, rather than in school and being interrupted by a fire alarm, they're two very different sensory inputs, but it's still sound.
And I also think that, you know, if we go back to kind of that school environment of where children do become overwhelmed and dysregulated with their senses, you know, secondary schools certainly don't have room, or, you know, to have some trumpets or mini trampolines, you know, out in the playground for children that need to regulate. And I know that lots of schools, secondary schools, have to choose, you know, going between lessons in between busy corridors as a sensory break, you know, for those secondary pupils. And that's not having a sensory break. That's having sensory overload, isn't it? When you're looking past, you know, another 150 pupils in a corridor.
And the people being close, as well as the noise, there's lots of different sensory inputs there.
And we go from, you know, and I think primary schools have, or, you know, make sure they have more opportunities for children to become regulated. You know, they will have you know, often most of them now have a sensory room, or, you know, will have somewhere where child can go and do the trampoline, or, you know, on yoga balls, and kind of do some more kind of focused, structured, you know, sensory kind of diet work. And then come 11, you know, 12, you chuck them into a secondary school, and all of that is stripped away, and all of that is taken away. And we've got these dysregulated young teenagers who are in absolute kind of crisis, you know? And then, you know, then we're wondering why there's, you know, teenagers not able to go to school. We're wondering why there's, you know, increase in mental health needs. I'm not saying a couple of bounces on a trampoline is going to fix it all, but it, you know, it certainly goes to helping, wouldn't it?
and it is actually about that practical application of what can we do within the current system to support children, and even if it's something as simple as allowing a child that does get sensory dysregulated space to move between classes on their own at secondary school, instead of seeing that break where everybody's moving as a possibility as a sensory break, because actually, if you were to collaborate with the child, I'm sure the child or the parent or both would be telling you that that potentially doesn't work for them.
Yeah, completely. And I think that's what's key, isn't it? That it's that, you know, children and young people are included in reviews and included in check-ins. You know, how's that going? You know, how is that going for you? What we've got in place? You know, how can we make that better for you? Because even if a strategy that a school uses is, you know, more of a blanket term, that's certainly not going to, you know, fit for every individual, is it?
No, and that's the individual, I can't say that word, individualised nature that we do need in terms of sensory experiences, and working with them and making sure that it's something that they want to sort of understand and work through as well, rather than it being done to them. And I think that that's an important thing as well. And I don't know if you remember this, but the delightful Richard Tice talking about, you know, having headphones in schools being ridiculous and all of that. It's just a definite sort of, it just shows the lack of understanding and thinking that if you expose an individual with sensory differences to enough sensory input, it will change. And that is just not true.
No, it doesn't work that way.
Exposure therapy for neurodivergent sensory needs is just not, no, that's not how you get rid of that anxiety.
Explosion there, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And interestingly stuff, when you said about that headphones example, I was having a chat with some 17 and 18-year-old, a group of young men with autism. This was last year, and I was asking them what would have been a better experience for you in secondary school. They'd all left and had just started college. I said, you know, if you can give me kind of one golden nugget that you could go back and tell your head teacher or your teacher. And they all said just being allowed to listen to music in my ears while I was doing my work, so that I could just kind of cut off all the other sensory input that was overwhelming me. And they all said it, and they all said it individually. You know, I didn't sort of, you know, meet with them as a group. I mean, that's not rocket science, is it? You know.
And I can speak to that as someone myself. I listen to music when I'm working.
Yeah.
You know, and we have that autonomy as adults to be able to do that, you know, and I've done it ever since I left school. Yeah. And I would definitely have found it beneficial if I'd been able to do it at school.
So much, you know, because like it goes back to what you were saying, wasn't it, about having autonomy over what senses you are choosing to receive, you know, with that music. And then you're having the autonomy, aren't you, to be able to block out all the stuff that is causing you that overwhelm. And, you know, what's going to happen? You're going to have pupils that make better progress academically, you know, and you know, make for happy, you know, happy people that have had a successful and positive experience in school. And that's the bit that, you know, we're not getting right all of the time.
No, absolutely. And thinking about the senses, and you know, one of the things that, you know, I'm kind of a bit afraid to admit it, actually, I suppose. when I first started exploring my potential neurodivergence, I did not know there were 8 senses.
There are indeed, and I don't think many people do still know that, Helen.
And it's like, I was 49.
Yeah.
And I didn't know there were 8 senses. And I look back and I think, oh, gosh, why did it? You know, and I know no one taught me. I went through the whole of school, and we were taught about the 5 senses, you know, the main ones that I probably can't remember if you ask me to reel them off. And then the additional 3, which are about balance, which is vestibular sense, proprioception, which is your position in the world, you relative to everything else. Yeah. And for a therapist, I was not trained in interoception as part of my therapy. Wow. Okay. We weren't even told about interoception.
That was even a thing.
It wasn't. And I find that astounding. Yeah. Because that's the internal understanding of your world. So being thirsty, being hungry, and it covers emotions and pain.
And even knowing when you need to go and have a wee, isn't it? You know?
Yeah.
I think, you know, I years and years ago kind of learned about, you know, the proprioception and vestibular, you know, part of your senses in terms of having I was working for a charity that supported children and adults with disabilities, and I had the absolute, luxury of working alongside paediatric occupational therapists that had really, really good knowledge and expertise in sensory processing difficulties. So, I was kind of trained up to the max for all those years. And then when I went on to headship, I made sure that, the schools that I worked in received that same training for the staff, because that, that to me was like, light bulb moment. I finally understand children.
Yeah.
So that, and then again, the interoception, I find hard to say. That's probably only been in the last 3 years or so that I've known about that in a bit more depth. But yeah, I'd imagine it's certainly not being taught in teacher training at university. I'd be very, very surprised. But like you said, as a therapist as well, that that wasn't on kind of your curriculum.
No, not on our radar at all. And I didn't do my therapy training that long ago, so it would have been good. And actually, even in schools, if we're teaching children and helping them to understand what these senses are.
No, they don't know.
I think it would be a wonderful addition to, are you listening? Department of Education.
That's it.
A wonderful addition to the curriculum. We're all for STEM. We're all for understanding ourselves and our mental health and talking about feelings. But I think there's almost a stage before that. If you want the emotional regulation within our children and adults, then we need to understand that sensory requirement. And this is not just for neurodivergent people, it's for everybody. It's almost like the base of the really important tower. And if you don't have it, everything comes tumbling down.
And, and you've got better people in the world, haven't you? If they remember to have a drink of water, or remember to go to the loo, remember to have their lunch, so that they are being productive in their day, they're giving back more to, the world, society, by doing that, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think, I remember when I was a head teacher, that, my admin team would say to me at 3:00, "You haven't had any lunch yet, Diane, have you?" And I'd be like, yeah, I'll have it in a minute. I realised 6 or 7, hours later, I still hadn't popped to the loo, because everything was in a minute. And I was not listening to my body giving me those signals. And I was probably getting a little bit irritable and, and lethargic and all those things. And kind of, my body's starting to give me signs that, but I wasn't picking up on it. So I learned, kind of tips I would learn is that, I had a reminder on my phone to make sure that I had a piece of fruit before 10:00 in the morning or whatever. And, if I hadn't eaten my lunch by 2:30, another reminder would go off. Because I'm rubbish at reminding myself to do those things. But I think, reminders are great, aren't they? Little alarms that go off.
That's one thing that technology has helped with. Though if you're a bit like me, if you set a reminder and it comes on your phone, you flick it away, then 2 seconds later you've forgotten, you actually remind yourself about it, which I do quite regularly. And actually, I think this is a really important point around sort of that understanding and the ability to focus on our own sensory needs when we struggle to focus anyway. It's actually quite hard to shift that focus onto yourself. Whether that's your internal signals or thinking about, you might be, because I've found a really simple trick that sometimes if I've almost overstimulated and I'm able to do this, to shut my eyes.
Okay.
Because I can take away one of the senses. Like that.
And just reduce
the input. And sometimes that clearly doesn't work because it depends how overstimulated you are.
Of course.
But it's just having the awareness that I can do that, and that is something that does affect me if I've overstimulated.
And it's a quick
thing to do. And if you don't have that awareness, then you're not even going to think of doing it, are you?
Even know, And I use that, I'm just thinking with, when you were saying what you do with your eyes, I was thinking if I'm in just pulled up on the side of the road because I've got lost and I'm feeling really overwhelmed or whatever it might be. I quite like to, doing deep breathing and doing the box breathing, breathing 4, holding 4, counting 4 or 6. And I use that with a lot of my foster children, when I can see just this sensory overload coming, to breathe, stop for a minute and just breathe.
And it's grounding.
It's really, really grounding. Yeah. So, and I think, you know, like you said, isn't it? It's being able to either take away one of your senses, like you are when you're closing your eyes, or whether it's focusing on one so that the others don't, you know, kind of fill your head for a moment, you know?
And you can combine the two, you know, and that's what I sometimes do, is close your eyes and do the box breathing.
Yeah.
Maybe put your hand on the chest so you can even feel the rise and fall.
And
really focusing in on those experiences in your body.
Yeah.
So that you are as present as you can be.
Yeah.
And that can sometimes bring that overwhelm under control. It's hard and it might not work all the time, and that's okay.
That's okay.
But you've maybe got something else in your toolbox, which is a good thing.
Yeah, definitely. And and that's key, isn't it? Having a few things in your toolbox up your sleeve, kind of ready to as I sit here with my fidget toy, so that I'm getting my proprioception so that I don't wiggle around in the video. Yeah, I wish I'd taken this into interviews over the years. I probably might have got offered more jobs.
And that's actually something that would be wonderful to see employees do, is, you know, it's okay for someone to bring in a fidget, you know, and I have that in my therapy room. I have a massive box of fidgets and people can come in and pick them up and, you know, transitions are actually easier for some of the autistic children that I might work with, because they can take a fidget home and bring it back, and it's like having a something that enables them to move from one space to another with that continuity.
And that's so important, isn't it? To, you know, to feel regulated and to want to come back and continue that engagement with you that's made them feel safe as well.
And I do think there are some big changes that we need to make, but there are also some of those little changes that we can do in those environments. And as a therapist, one of the things is actually noticing those sensory experiences. And as parents too, you know, being curious about our children's sensory experiences, particularly when we're first starting that maybe diagnosis journey.
And I think that, you know, if you are a parent of a neurodivergent child and you're wondering kind of whether they, you know, maybe divergent, or you don't, you know, you're not sure yet, I think, you know, being kind to yourself when that child does have that sensory overwhelm. Because if it's screaming on the beach because they got wet sand in between their toes, and you're trying to work out how to get them up to the top of the beach with a bottle of water and a towel, you know, to clean on their feet and all that stuff that is sensory overload, you know, thinking back to I think that's most neurodivergent parents' experiences on the beach. You know, that, just being aware that is okay. And yes, it might happen at the end of a beach experience, for example, but actually if you had a really nice 5 or 6 hours on the beach all day, don't let that 10 minutes at the end feel like it's destroyed the day.
And that can be hard, can't it? Because, you know, it's tough when you're a parent and you might be neurodivergent yourself as well. So you're maybe coping with dysregulation and trying to support your own child's dysregulation.
Completely. And that's, you know, it's hard work being a parent, isn't it? So I think, you know, when you throw all that in as well, and you're both, you know, completely overloaded with your senses on, you know, one day or from one experience together, you know, it's kind of like you don't even have time to put the oxygen mask on first, do you? Because you've clearly got to deal with your child that, you know, might be feeling like they're in distress. Yeah.
So I guess, you know, we've talked a little bit about some tips, which is really being curious. Grounding, understanding that complete sort of, whether it's sensory seeking, sensory triggers, understanding that there can be differences as well, depending on your environments and depending on how that sensory need is being experienced, if there is autonomy or collaboration within that. I'm wondering if, you know, for maybe educators first and then maybe parents, if there's any little tips that maybe we haven't covered that you think is worth calling out.
I think it's about, you know, certainly from an education perspective, I think it's about, it goes back to what you're saying really about being curious, really, for, you know, people that work in schools, not to just say, oh, that child's overwhelming, shall we stick some, you know, ear defenders on them, you know, and think that might just help, or give them this and they'll get on with their maths lesson. You know, what is it that is overwhelming that child? You know, what are they avoiding from a sensory perspective, or what are they really seeking? And, you know, that might just be a case of them needing, you know, twice a day to go and bounce on the trumpet in the garden. You know, it could sometimes be that, you know, that simple, but it's knowing, and it's, you know, it's talking to the child if you can, it's talking to the family. And yeah, and not assuming that every child needs ear defenders and a fidget toy.
Yeah.
Because it might be something that they've been, you know, made to sit in the dinner hall, you know, with 200 other pupils all being noisy, and that's not how they can eat their dinner at home.
Or there are too many people near them. It's proprioception. It's not just noise.
Sound, the touch.
It could be the touching and you're too close to me.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
And how can you eat your school lunch when all of that's going on?
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
You know, suddenly, you know, you're not going to feel hungry, are you?
No.
And I think that's the key bit for me. And that's always something that I've advocated for working in schools, is know your children.
And I suppose that feeds into this concept of the sort of understanding bias we have around whatever label a child might have. Is that they are still completely unique, and just because it worked for one child that was autistic or an ADHD doesn't mean that it will necessarily work that child.
Completely.
And it's thinking about that.
And I think, you know, thankfully long gone are the days in schools where you'd hear, you know, if you said, oh, we might have a child starting in our school, you know, they have diagnosis of autism, for example, you know, and somebody pipes up, oh yeah, I worked with an autistic child once, you know, in 1982. You know, it's and I think, you know, I do believe that, you know, education has moved away from that, and there is, you know, much more depth of understanding, as you said, about every child and young person being unique, whether they're neurodivergent or not. And that's the most important bit, isn't it? You don't just have an assumption, like, or a perception of what somebody's going to be like.
And I think that it's hard when, you know, parents don't necessarily have a huge amount of time because they're working, they've maybe got other responsibilities, but certainly in schools it's difficult to spend that time, but I think it pays off, and actually it ends up being less time consuming and so much more supportive for the children concerned.
And I you know, going on from that, I think what is sometimes missing in schools, when, you know, kind of my consultant hat on, is that we forget to ask the questions about what happens at home. You know, how, you know, and if you are having reviews with, you know, a family, find out what their bedtime routine is, find out whether they have breakfast in the mornings, find out that stuff that calms that, you know, your child that's sitting in your classroom, you know, seems to bounce from one wall to another. I think we're very good at asking the tick box questions, but we forget to do the holistic stuff sometimes. And just knowing that a child hasn't had breakfast can be the answer to the first 2 or 3 hours of how that child learns and copes in school that morning, you know. And those are the questions that I think we forget to ask sometimes.
And it's important to think about it holistically, isn't it?
And I think, you know, the word I can't say, interoception, you know, especially if you're supporting a child that has difficulty with that, you know, that sense, they're going to be relying on that adult to say, aren't they, do you think you need to go and grab an apple out your school bag? Or, you know, they're jiggling around or not concentrating, you know, do you think it's, you know, maybe pop to the loo and have a wee? Because we don't think of those things, do we?
No, we don't. And actually, that brings us on nicely to maybe finishing this podcast episode. So thank you so much, because the next one we're going to be talking about interoception. So that'll be episode 3. We look forward to seeing everybody next time.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you very much.
Take care, everybody.